So I want to welcome everyone. If you don't know me, I'm Debbie Goldich. I'm the International President, there I am, of Women's League. And welcome to another one of our wonderful Women's League Reads programs. And I want to thank Susan Farber and Merle Carrus for all the work they do as volunteers to make this an incredible program. And Diane Friedgut's with us today with 10 of the women from Israel from our sister Kahilot, and we welcome all of our Israeli sisters as well as everyone who's on today from all over North America. I want to do a special shout out to Sheila Kaufman and Toby Mazer, who are volunteers extraordinaire who are helping with the tech today. And Women's League is a volunteer organization, volunteer driven, and all the wonderful things that we do and we accomplish are because of our volunteers, and we never forget to thank them for everything that they do to make us look good in the world of conservative Judaism. So I am going to turn it right over to Susan and Merle.
All right. I guess I'll begin. Good afternoon or good evening or good morning, because I think we have some people from Texas and California with us. I'm not sure. But I welcome all of you to our summertime Women's League Reads, where Rabbi Dr. Haviva Ner-David will converse with Merle and all of us about her recent first novel, Hope Valley. She is a resident of Kibbutz Hanaton in the Galil. She has been an author of other works, not just fiction. She is focusing on the spiritual growth of individuals and developing relationships between our faiths as well as our cultures, locally on the ground, I presume, and elsewhere as well when opportunities present themselves. Diane Friedgut pointed out that Rabbi Dr. Haviva Ner-David is also helping with learning opportunities through the Masorti Day of Study Days, as well as perhaps even, which is co-facilitated by Schechter Institute. So I turn this over to Merle and Haviva to start our conversation. I will be taking notes as I typically do, and will post them when Haviva has reviewed them and agreed that I've represented our conversation correctly, as well as include the link I get about this recording. Thank you so much for joining us. Merle.
Hi, thank you. And welcome, Haviva. We look forward to hearing more about your book. And to start us off, if you could just give us maybe an overview of the plot summary of Hope Valley, and then we'll get into some questions.
Okay, great. So as we had said when we met before, I'm not going to give any spoilers. So I'll give like the background of the book and sort of the first couple of chapters, what happens, and then leave it at that. So, okay. So Hope Valley, this is Hope Valley, is about two women, Tikva and Ruby, although her given name is Rabbi, but she's called Ruby in the book, that's her nickname. So it's about two women and it's told from their shifting points of view. Each chapter is told first from Ruby, then from Tikva, Ruby, Tikva. And there's also a diary that's excerpted throughout the novel, and that's written by Ruby's father, Jamal. So Tikva moved to Israel right out of high school and right after the 6-Day War. And she is the daughter of two Holocaust survivors. And in their house, it was very secretive. She doesn't really know much about what happened, if anything, to her parents in the war. And they're not Zionists. She discovers Zionism on her own and really against their will moves to Israel and marries Alon. And they live in Jerusalem and then they move north to the Galil after Alon, something happens in the Lebanon War and in the first Lebanon War, and he has post-trauma stress disorder. And he was involved with dogs in the army. He revived the K9 unit. Okay. And he loved dogs, and he tells her, after this happened in the Lebanon War, he doesn't know exactly what happened. He says he does not want to have another dog. Okay, so and they're living in the Galil, and they're running a bed and breakfast. So that's Tikva, and she was also diagnosed with multiple sclerosis before the book begins. And because of her husband Alon's trauma from the war, there isn't a lot of room in their relationship for her own pain. So that's important to know as well. Ruby, she left Israel. She was born in Israel, and she left. She's Palestinian Israeli, and she left because of an abusive marriage, and kind of ran away and hasn't been back to Israel for 25 years. She's an artist, and actually Tikva is also an artist, although Tikva is a frustrated artist. She hasn't been painting since she was diagnosed with MS. And Ruby is a somewhat famous artist, and so she's an acclaimed artist, and she's diagnosed with cancer. And she decides to come back to Israel for treatments and to be with her mother. Her father has died since she's been away. She was very close to her father. And when she comes back, there's a letter from her father that her mother gives her, an unopened letter. She reads it, and it says that he had written a diary and left it in the home that he was expelled from in 1948 in the village, and his village was destroyed. And he left a diary in this home that he was living in until then, at age 20. And he never came back to the village. The villagers were not allowed to come back. And so he had left that diary thinking that he would come back and get it. And so he asked her in the letter to please find the diary. She's living in the home that she grew up in, which is, okay, so this is important, is that there's a valley, Hope Valley, and Tikva lives on one side of the valley in a moshav that was built over this village that Ruby's father Jamal lived in. The other side of the valley is the home where Ruby grew up, which is her father. When he came back, he ended up marrying his cousin, who he was betrothed to. He marries his cousin, who was living in the Palestinian Israeli village that's on the other side of the valley that was not destroyed in 1948. So that's the background of the characters. And what happens is that the novel begins with Ruby looking for the diary. It's late at night, and she's decided she's going to cross over the valley into the moshav. And so that's how the story begins. She has a flashlight. It's late at night. She makes a hole in the fence that divides the valley from the moshav. She goes through the hole, and she goes to the house, and she's about to break into the house. She falls and makes a noise. And then it moves over to the point of view of Tikva. And she comes out. With her own flashlight to see where the noise is coming from. And whoever was there ran away. We, the readers, know that it was Ruby, but she doesn't know that. And she, instead of finding Ruby, she finds a dog. So that's the dog on the cover, who she names Cain. It's a half Canaanite dog, half shepherd. And this dog ends up bringing the two women together, because then a few days later, Tikva is out walking the dog, and there's a gunshot. Cain runs when she hears the gunshot and disappears, and Tikva is looking for Cain and realizes that Cain went through this hole that Ruby had made in the fence, although she doesn't know that it was made by Ruby. She goes through the hole, and the two women meet in the valley. And I'm going to stop in a minute because I don't want to give away too much, but they end up meeting in the valley and soon discover in this conversation that Tikva is actually living in the house that Jamal grew up in. And this is it's the only house the only building that stayed standing from the village. And as soon as Ruby realizes that, she wants to befriend Tikva. so that she can get to the diary. And that's how the book begins. And at first, the women are not fast friends. There's animosity between them. There's fear and suspicion, and the two women do become friends. That much I can tell you. So that's the story. I mean, that's just the beginning of the story. Yeah.
Right. So Tikva has come from the United States and made Aliyah to Israel because she had this Zionist feeling as a young person. And I think a lot of us maybe have that kind of background also, that kind of Zionist feeling that was here in the United States very strong in the 60s and 70s. And then I think a large part of this also is the idea of how she finds out through the story and talking to Ruby, more of the reality of that Zionist, how that really, the reality in Israel, how that changes. And so can you talk a little bit about how that changes her as she's coming to realize Ruby, getting to know Ruby a little bit as they get friendly?
Sure. So first of all, I guess I should also say that the backstory of the novel takes place in 1948. That's the story with the diary, or the story that's told in the diary. And the fourth story, the front story, is in the year 2000, in the summer of 2000, right before the second Intifada breaks out. And it actually does break out at the end of the book. So that's, I should say also that's kind of the historical setting of both stories. And I thought of it when you said that, especially that when Tikva moves to Israel, when she makes Aliyah, it's right after the Six-Day War, the 1967 war. And there was, definitely that euphoria from winning the war. And so she's swept up in all of that as well. So what happens is, so that as she becomes friends with Ruby and starts to hear Ruby's story and her family's story, then she starts to realize that the story that she had been told, the narrative, the Zionist narrative that she had been taught in her Zionist youth movement, was not that it wasn't true. It was all true, but it was only part of the picture and part of the story. And so that it's a lot of what the book is really also about is her story, and how does she deal with that, with kind of discovering that she hadn't been told the whole story, and now what does she do with that information, especially because she moved to Israel from this place of Zionism ideology, feeling like she was doing the right thing and kind of feeling really good about that, and then discovering that it's much more complicated than she had realized. So it's through her friendship with Ruby. There's also another piece, which is that her daughter Talia, she discovers also a little bit further on in the book, but also toward the beginning, that Talia is actually in a romance with a Palestinian Israeli man from Jaffa. And so both of those things happening at once, first her meeting Ruby and finding out about that she's living in this house that was Ruby's father's house. And she didn't even realize that there had been this village where her moshav is. So she didn't know that whole history. And so discovering all of that at the same time that she discovers this about her daughter. And so all of that kind of comes to a head, and that's what starts to open her eyes and ears. And so, yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your personal journey, because you also came from the United States and made Aliyah. Were some of the same thoughts and feelings the reason that you made Aliyah, or are you similar to Tikva in that way?
Yeah, so I'm not Tikva, she's not me, and that's important to say. This isn't memoir, and I did write 2 memoirs before this, and this is very clearly a different project, and I can talk more about that as well. But to answer this particular question, so I moved here. First of all, also Tikva is a different time period. So I was born in 1969. She was already living here then, and so. But I grew up in a Zionist home and went to Zionist school and camp, and so definitely. I moved here out of Zionist ideology, absolutely. And it was just, realizing that it was more complicated. I was not as naive as Tikva was. That's also important to say. From the beginning, we lived in Jerusalem for 13 years, and then we moved to Hanatan, and we've been here for 11, maybe 12 years. I'm not sure exactly. So almost equal amount of time in Jerusalem and here. And from the beginning, I was involved with dialogue groups, and I sent my kids to something called Kids for Peace. And, so that it wasn't that I wasn't aware of all this, but it was different, I think, especially when I moved to the Galil, where our kibbutz is really surrounded by Palestinian Israeli villages, more or less. And so when we moved here, I just felt so much more strongly, that Jews aren't the only ones who live in Israel. And I started to, in a more day-to-day basis, I made friends, and I got involved with a narrative sharing group and all kinds of things my younger kids went to, and the last one is still there, at a hand-in-hand Yad B'Yad school, which is a bilingual Arab Jewish school. And so I just was living this much more intensely when I moved up here. And I think a lot of it was also, even so, like Tikva, I mean, I Hanatan, where I live, was not built on an Arab village. But I discovered, for example, that Tzipori, which is about 10, 15 minutes from Hanatan, the Tzipori, the Moshav, that it was on a village called Sephoria. And there's a lot of other examples like this that I just didn't know, because it doesn't say, there isn't a sign that says that, that what was here before 1948. And so a lot of this I discovered through friends that I made whose families were from these places. And so they told me the stories of their family. And it was just harder to close my eyes to all of this when it was friends who told me stories like that. I mean, a lot of the people from this village, Sephoria, went to Nazareth afterward, the ones who didn't, let's say, flee to Lebanon or Syria. So they moved to Nazareth, a lot of them. And so some of them are still there. And so these are people that I know. And you can see that from Nazareth, they see where their family's village was. I mean, it's just right there. And so it was just harder for me once, hearing these stories, hearing their pain. I really felt that part of my mission with writing this book, although it's a novel, it's not it's not a book with a mission in that way exactly, but my feeling, what inspired me to write the book, there are a few things that inspired me to write the book. One was wanting to share some of these stories that I have access to and that I just felt that I wanted to share with the world. So they're in different ways, you see them in the book. The book is not about exactly these people that I know, but definitely the feeling and the stories do end up in the book in some way. Another thing was wanting to write a book about someone who moves to Israel with, out of Zionist ideology, and then has to grapple with finding out that she wasn't told the entire story. I hadn't read another novel that did that, and I thought that was just such an interesting and an interesting story to tell. And so those were two of the things that inspired me, and I can tell a story about what really got me to start writing.
Yes, tell us what inspired you to start.
Now, okay, I don't even remember what the original question was right now that we're discussing, but so what I have been thinking about all of these things and wanting to tell some of these stories and grapple with this, and I had considered maybe memoir, and then one day I was walking with my dog and in the valley, which is, so Hanatan also, there's a valley, on one side of the valley is Hanatan, and the other side of the valley is a Bedouin village called Bir al-Maksor. And I was walking with my dog in the valley, and I saw a shepherd, Hussein, who I would often see when I was walking my dog. And this time, though, he had a woman with him. I had never seen him with a woman before. And this woman was foraging, actually, which is a theme in the book. when the women, they do forage together. So this woman was foraging, and I went over and said hello, and Hussein told me that this was his wife, and he introduced us. And then she asked me how old I was, and I told her, and she started to cry, and she told me that I was the same age as her daughter, who had died from breast cancer. And it was very touching, it was moving, and we talked about her, and we hugged, and and said goodbye, and I was walking home. And while I was walking home, I started to think, wow, I really wish I had met this woman who I was just told about, but I would never meet her because she was no longer alive. And I especially thought how, because I live with a muscular disease, a form of muscular dystrophy called FSHD. And I thought, oh, that's something maybe we could have also bonded over, the fact that we both lived with illness. And I kind of started to tell this whole story in my head. Well, what if I had met her? And by the time I got home, I had already kind of started writing a novel. So that's why this is a novel. And I think, this idea of two people connecting and over something so human as living with illness, and which is the same in the book. That does, many things changed over the 8 years that I was from that day when I started writing the book in my head till the day the book came out. It was like 8 years, and a lot in the manuscript changed over that time, but one thing definitely stayed the same, which was that kernel of the two women meeting in the valley. So that was something I wanted to explore, and I did. So yeah.
Right, because it's interesting that a lot of these different programs, like I think you were mentioning about your children doing programs with Palestinian Arabs, like they talk about a lot of the ways that we can build relationships is between some personal, something that you have in common with the other person that's outside of the fact that you're Israeli and they're Palestinian. And it's, so you've taken that idea of Ruby has a cancer and Tikva has MS, and you've created a personal relationship that builds because they can talk about illness, or they share that, that personal issue, as opposed to the fact of a political issue. You take that piece out of it. And then these two people just can be friends and realize you can be friends with someone, of a different background, even though their families may be fighting, or their people may be, because Ruby does say, like, she doesn't involve her family. She doesn't want her family really to know that she's made this friend at the beginning, that they, it's just them connecting over this thing. So that's really interesting. So how did you feel being able to tell Ruby's story, like, that you would know enough from her perspective to be able to tell the story from her perspective?
So actually, the first draft of the book was told all from Tikva's point of view. And it's, I think down deep inside, I knew that the best way to tell the story would be to shift the point of view between the two women. But I think at the beginning, I really was afraid to try to do that. I was thinking, well, how could I write from the point of view of a Palestinian woman? And so that it took me a while to actually get up the courage to do that. And I think part of it was that I got to know her as a character over that time. And then eventually I just felt like I know this woman better than anyone else, and I can write from her point of view. Another thing that freed me, I think, was thinking of it as writing from Ruby's point of view and not from a Palestinian woman's point of view, so that she's her own unique person who I created. And so I felt like then I could write from her point of view. And also because so much of her does come also from people that I know. So it wasn't just something I created out of my imagination. It was also so much listening, so much what I call like deep listening or sacred listening to other people's stories. And so I know that I was nervous about this even till after it came out, and a Palestinian friend of mine read the book who has excellent English, and well, two actually. So they both said that they thought that I did a great job with Ruby. And Jamal too, that's another thing. Jamal is a 20-year-old Palestinian man in 1948 who I write this diary from his point of view. And in some ways I feel like he's most like me in some ways actually, which is interesting. So in some ways I identify with him the most. He's also a poet, and so I'm a writer, so that's another thing. And a writer, he writes the diary. The two women are artists, so he's the writer. But there's one friend of mine who read it. She said, "Oh, I want to get together on Zoom." You know, this was Zoom time when it came out. I want to get together on Zoom and talk about it with you. And I was nervous that she was going to tell me that, you know, I'm your friends and everything, but I have to say, like, whatever, Ruby, maybe, you know, maybe she wasn't so thrilled about the way that I portrayed her and maybe didn't think it was so authentic, but I was so pleasantly surprised when she told me that the thing that moved her most about the book was that I could write from Ruby's point of view. And she said that just, you know, shows that I was able to really listen and really identify and really step into the shoes of a Palestinian Israeli woman. And she felt like that touched her very deeply.
So one of the points that you just mentioned was the foraging, that Ruby's out foraging for medicinal plants, I think is what she is always looking for. And then she starts to teach Ruby how to look at the plants. And she talks about making sure Tikva, she's teaching Tikva. And Tikva's a little nervous about whether she's pulling something that's poisonous or healthy. How do you know? So they have a conversation about that, which was, I think, kind of significant, the idea of whether you're picking a plant that's poisonous or healthy, or in relationships that can be poisonous and healthy maybe, or
yeah, so much so. I think one thing that metaphor of the foraging, and that's something, a refrain that she also says at least a couple of times in the book, of this fear of following her instincts. And so, and Ruby also says to her that, yes, you need to follow your instincts, but you also need to be smart about it. You know, so part of it is following your instincts, part of it is also following your heart, and part of it is also not being stupid, you know? So like that is this metaphor throughout the book too, because Tikva isn't sure how much, and both women are not sure how much they can trust each other. And so there's that element of just having to, at some point, just trust their instincts, that they can trust each other, even if both of their societies are telling them that they can't.
right.
So that definitely is also a metaphor in the book.
Eva, there's a question in the chat. Besides your two friends, your two Palestinian friends, do you happen to know if there are other Palestinian Israelis who've read the book and what they think about it?
Let's see. So I've had a lot of feedback, and positive feedback, which was great. In terms of thinking, it's in English. I mean, so that's something that maybe maybe I'll say something about it now. In fact, I would love to have it translated into Hebrew and Arabic. And I think it could be a great tool also for dialogue, you know, to have, let's say, groups of people who are reading it in Arabic and Hebrew, and then getting together and talking about it. So that's when I was writing it, and because that's my native mother tongue is English, and so that's what I write in. And so in some ways, it's right now for more of an English-speaking audience, which means not necessarily the people who are living this as much. I mean, a lot of people can read English, and so they have, but I think also a lot of people say to me that even if they do read English or speak English, that it's different to read a book that is in English. So I really would like to have it translated into Hebrew, into Arabic, so that I could get more feedback from people who live here. But I say that, so I'm trying to just think of other people who have gotten back to me about it. And nothing's popping into my head at the moment of like a specific person. I've had a lot of positive feedback, and people also who live here who have told me that by reading it, that they just see things differently and see things that they had never seen before, that it just kind of opens up a whole new perspective, a whole world to them that they just hadn't recognized or realized. Even people who live with me here in Hanatan who have this same environment that I do, but just hadn't, I guess they didn't seek it out as much as I did. And so to the point where people have now, since reading the book, have joined dialogue groups and shared society groups and things like that, because they said that it really, really changed their life, the book. So that's the first step, for me is to open people's eyes a little bit about these things, but not just Jews. And so that's something else that I know we talked about before, that when we got together before, that I also, it was really important to me that the book be told from both points of view, not just to include the Palestinian narrative, but also to make sure that the Zionist narrative is here as well in the book, because it also is true. And Palestinians also only get part of the story. So one of the things that I think this book really accomplishes is showing more of a full picture by showing both narratives. And so that's something that I would also hope that the book will continue to do, and you can't read the book without sympathizing with both people and with both narratives.
So, Ray, so would you like to talk about the message that you want people to take away from the book?
So it's interesting too, that theme too of whether art can have a message or not. So I actually address that in the book, because the two women are artists, and there's this point in the book where they go to see Ruby. Ruby has an exhibit on the Jaffa port, and the women go to see it, and they talk about art and what is good art and what bad art. There's also a conversation between Talia and Ruby about that subject as well. So I think I was also kind of addressing it for this book as well, because the book, I didn't write it with a message necessarily. I mean, it's a story, it's a novel, and I needed to learn to write a novel when I was writing this novel, because I had written memoir before. So it's not, I could have written a treatise or something, if I wanted to just say, this is what I think we need to all do to solve the conflict. But so it's first and foremost, it's a story. But I also do believe that good art does leave you with some kind of feeling. And I think a feeling this book leaves us with, first of all, is hope, that there is hope for this place. And part of that hope lies in recognizing each other's humanity, recognizing each other's pain, and not trying to compare pain, our pain is greater than yours or anything like that. It's just about being able to recognize that we all suffer, we all have pain, it's a book of refugees. I mean, everyone in the book practically is a refugee in some way or another. And to recognize that and to decide to work together instead of against each other. So that is definitely a big message in the book. Also this idea that, we're all human beings when it comes down to it, that's really what matters, is we're all humans and we're all connected. And I'm not going to give away the end of the book, but that's definitely a message of the book, is that we are all connected. And we are all connected in this place. I mean, I know, living here, so Palestinians and Jews call each other cousins. That's just how they, our Bnei Dodim is what they say, our cousins. And it's true, because we are cousins. That's what we are. And so it's all the more tragic that we can't get along. And so I do believe that our mission here is to find a way to get along. And if we can, then wow, then we've really done what we're meant to do. I was actually at an event on Friday where someone said that even in Galilee, that's even more so, because the proportions here are 50-50 pretty much. And so That's what they said. And so, if we can get along here in this part of the country too, then that shows that we can do it all. We can do it in Israel in general. So that's one message. And another strong message of the book is about history and how history repeats itself. So there's the backstory in 48 and there's the story in 2000. And there's so many parallels between the two stories, which I can't say I did it on purpose, really. When I was writing, I didn't outline the book before I wrote it. I just had this idea of these two women, and then the diary idea came up. Over time, all these elements came into the book, and the ending, I didn't know how it was going to end, and I also didn't map out like all the different things all the symbolism in the book came out as I was writing it, because we're surrounded by symbolism in our lives all the time if we just look around and open our eyes to it. So also the symbolism all came out. I maybe highlighted it once I realized it. So the same thing with the parallels between 48 and 2000. As I was writing it, there were just all these parallels. And so again, I highlighted them and kind of put them in the places where you'd realize that they were parallels. So, and then also here, so in 2014, there were parallels with what happened in 48 and 2000. And then the book was already out. And just a few months ago,
Right.
The same things happening all over again, the rioting, the racism, the what's the word? I can't, I'll think of the word.
Right.
But all of this happening again, and I was living it again, and I felt like I was living in my novel all over again. So this message of how history will keep repeating itself if we don't change something, that there needs to be some kind of corrective, some kind of tikkun happening. And we do have that in the book, because Ruby and Tikva are a tikkun. That's what they are in the book. And that's kind of, said even in some ways. And then also the daughter, Talia, with her boyfriend is in some ways also a tikkun. And so there's that's part of a message of the book, is that we can't just keep repeating the historical mistakes, that we need to be going in a spiral. So I can even read to you what Ruby says to Tikva when she's describing this art that she did, this mandala art. And she says, she says, these paintings combine the linear and the circular, as does life. We move forward as we spiral back to our core. Each reconnection to our essence strengthens us for the next spiral, hopefully even correcting past mistakes, healing old wounds. And so that is a theme in the book, this idea that, and I didn't say this before, that it's about healing the wounds. So I'm glad that Ruby reminded me that it's not just about connecting over our humanity. So it's not just about discovering we're all human, we all live, we all die, we all get sick. But I think that something else that needs to happen here as well, which is the actual healing of the wounds. And so you can't just kind of put a Band-Aid over all of it and pretend it didn't happen. There does need to be that real, and in the book they do that. So I want to say that the women at the beginning, they don't get along. And there is this fear and suspicion between them, and lack of trust. And they do touch on the really painful issues. And by my decision to have Tikva living in the house that Jamal was living in and that this diary is in, I decided to do that because I was really looking for like what could be the most kind of conflictual way that I could address this conflict. And so that to make it like it's this very house that they both feel connected to, and they both have a claim to, because they really both do have a claim to the house and both feel a very deep connection to the house, just like this land. And so they really do talk about the difficult issues, and they don't just gloss over them. And that's part of the healing that needs to happen, in my opinion.
I may have a couple of other questions. Did you have any discussion with the parents of the woman who was the inspiration for the Ruby character?
What, I'm sorry, you said the inspiration for the
parent-
movie character?
The parents of the inspiration for Ruby. Did you have a chance to
Shepherd
talk
and
to those
Shepherd
parents?
and his wife who were foraging. You were-
What about, I'm sorry, what was the question then about them? About Hussein and his
Were
wife?
you able to discuss, talk to the parents of the Ruby character?
Yeah. About the book?
As an
Or just in general?
inspiration, did you have discussions with the parents of the woman who was the inspiration for the Ruby character about what she was like?
Oh, so I did that day. I didn't go back to discover more about her, actually. I've seen Hussein many times since then. I still see him all the time. This is a lovely idea. No one has asked me this before. Thank you so much. I will take the book out to the field with me and show it to him. That is such a beautiful idea. It became so, removed from that. I mean, that was like the spark. And then Ruby is not their daughter. I mean, she's totally a different character. Her daughter was not an artist. None of that. That all came later. And so it really, I always thought of it as more just like the spark that put this idea in my head. But it is really such a lovely idea to give them a copy of the book. I actually just was at the home of a different home of people who live in that same village that he lives in, Bir al-Maqsur, where their two sons who are right now soldiers in the Israeli army were at the beach, and they were physically attacked with knives and stabbed, and they're alive. They're both alive and they're back home, but in a racial hate crime. And so a bunch of people from the area, a bunch of Jews from the area went over to their house to say how sorry we were that this happened. And I gave them a copy of the book. I said, this is the valley that's between your village and our kibbutz. And I told them, the story and the whole thing. But this was not Hussein. But I will do that maybe tomorrow. Thank you for that beautiful idea.
Okay, and the next one
Oh, I
says,
wonder how. I'm just
the
thinking
next one says, I read and listened to an author talk about All the Rivers by Dorit Rabbanan. The book was about an Israeli and Palestinian love relationship. The book was banned in Israel for a while. Did you get any negative feedback for your book?
No. First of all, hers was written in Hebrew. And so when it was banned, it was the Hebrew one, and then it was translated into English, if I'm not mistaken. There was a lot of publicity around it when it was banned. So mine was written in English, and so it hasn't, and her book was it was on the list of books to read for the Babliyot, which is the, it's like the equivalent of the Regents in the United States. So it was like a high school book that people were reading. And so that it got a lot of attention. All of a sudden, people in Miscara Chinuch in the education ministry saw that this was a book they were suggesting to high school students to read, and they got all upset. Is this saying that we're telling people that they should be having interfaith relationships, and so that's why that happened. So no, I haven't gotten negative reaction that I know. I mean, on Facebook, people have written negative things to me, but mostly not, actually. And I think a lot of that is because I have the two narratives here. And so it's not a pro-Palestinian book. It's not a pro-Zionist book. It's a pro living together in peace book. So I think some people who might have even gone into reading it thinking I'm not going to like this, liked it anyway, because as I said, it shows both stories and how they're both true. So I have no banning that, so far at least. Although maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing because it would definitely bring publicity, more publicity to the book. But yeah.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about the cover art? Usually you don't get to pick your cover, I think, when you publish a book.
So yeah. Okay, so here's the book. The book was put out by Bedazzled Ink Press, which is a small press in California. And one of the benefits of that was that they let me have a lot of control over the cover, whereas if it had been one of the big mainstream presses in the United States, I've been told that they choose your cover for, or they give you a choice between this and this, so I really worked with them on the cover. My daughter, Meira, who is studying at Bezalel, which actually is Alon and Tikva both studied at Bezalel as well. So I got to put that into the book. But Meira is studying at Bezalel right now, and she's an artist. And so she did the cover. We went out and photographed, and then she did this watercolor painting. And it's a painting. It's meant to be a painting, and it's actually not finished. So it's a work in progress. And the symbolism of that is that like this country, which is a work in progress, and it's imperfect. There's a water stain on it as well. So that's, first of all, to draw attention to the fact that it's a painting. You're supposed to realize it's a painting, and also to show that it is imperfect. So there's the valley, and there's the 3 Abrahamic religions, if you can see. They're kind of living in peace in the valley. It's the 2 women and the dog, Cain. And Cain is this kind of all-knowing figure in the book. And she also represents the land. She, as Ruby even says at some point about her, she says, "Oh, your ancestors could tell me more about this place, than anyone else." So she's a Canaan dog, and she's this kind of all-knowing character. So the way she's looking at the reader here, has that kind of like winking at you type of look. And there's the tree of hope. So this is the tree of hope. The valley is called Hope Valley, and this tree is called the Tree of Hope in the book. And it has 3 trunks that also representing the 3 Abrahamic religions. And as I said, the symbolism just happened. So I actually was in an ancient olive grove near us, hiking, and saw these amazing trees, which they say the oldest ones are like 2,000 years old. So this one is 2,000 years old. And this is only a piece of it, but these trees are amazing. They're huge, and you can walk into them, and some of them have a lot of different trunks that all kind of come together. So that's what this one does. 3 trunks, and there's a canopy of leaves that is over the, it builds this kind of like a structure that people come and sit under. So it's where Ruby and Tikva spend a lot of their time, and also where Jamal and Marie, who you'll meet when you read the diary, also spend a lot of time together. And so that's what this tree of hope also symbolizes. So I love the cover, and I'm so happy that I was able to have this say in what it would be, because it's important. And I think it's it's the thing that people see. So yeah, I think it's its own piece of art. So I'm proud of it. Yeah.
Would you like to tell us a little bit about some of your other writings, what your memoirs and other things that you've written?
Oh, I didn't. I don't have any in this room, but I could run out and get them, but I'll just tell you. So the first is a memoir called Life on the Fringes, and that came out in 2000. And it actually was a runner-up for the National Jewish Book Award in 2000 in nonfiction. And that's about my journey. I grew up in a Orthodox home in New York, and that book has a lot of halakha in it. I'm a rabbi also. We didn't talk about it, any of that. And the book is a spiritual book as well, I would say. And it's about my grappling with being a feminist and being traditional and deciding I wanted to become a rabbi, but I wanted to be an Orthodox rabbi, which I'm not. I mean, I did receive Orthodox ordination. That happens at the end of the second memoir, which is called Hannah's Voice. So there's Life on the Fringes, Hannah's Voice. But then after I received this private ordination from a rabbi in Jerusalem, I left the Orthodox movement. And so that's, you could read those books, but then I have a third memoir coming out at the end of this year, which is more updated as well. So I really do love writing memoir, although now that I've written this novel, I think my next book is going to be another novel. So it was a learning curve, but I think I did it. And so I want to do it again. It was amazing to write, and it was amazing to build this whole world. Oh, look at that. That's the first one. That's Life on the Fringes. Thank you so much. Wow. There it is. Yeah. And Hannah's Voice. Yeah, I don't think I have it.
She has the book, and Diane Freegut wrote, I recommend Life on the Fringes. Wonderful writing. So you're getting a lot
of plugs.
Yeah. What year did, excuse me, Haviva, what year did Hannah's Voice come out?
I think that might have been 2014. I think that's when it was.
Okay.
I know it was during that Gaza war that I went to the States on a little book tour that summer, and so I guess it came out that year. The first one is has a lot of halakha in it, a lot of Jewish religious law about women in Judaism, and so I weave memoir and all this scholarship that I did on these subjects of women in Judaism. And the second one, it really weaves memoir with more Hasidic texts and Kabbalistic texts. So, and my third one, when it comes out, actually weaves memoir with a lot of dream work. I do a lot of work with dreams now. I'm also a spiritual companion now. I studied spiritual companionship, and I do a lot of work with dreams. And so it's interesting how my life has changed and the different kinds of texts that I use to put alongside the memoir material.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions in the chat or?
No, just a couple of comments that Diane Freegut shared with everyone. I loved a lot about the book, but a point I discussed with Haviva was what I saw was the lack of information. It sounds as if the state of Israel was declared in 1948 and that no one attacked the Jewish inhabitants, when in fact, there was an immediate major attack and non-acceptance of the Jewish state by Arab populations, both inside and outside of Israel.
So actually that is very clear in the book. So Diane, maybe read it again. There's a point, especially that whole backstory in the diary. So that you actually see that that happens in real time in the diary. So the partition plan, Jamal says that he personally believed that the Palestinians should have accepted the partition plan, but he says that they didn't. And he's very upset about that. And then the state is declared and they're attacked. The Jews are attacked by the surrounding Arab countries. And that's all happening in the 1948 diary. And the violence, there's violence in the book. I don't have a high threshold for violence, but I did put some in there. So there's killing, there's violence, and it's not all done by Jews in the book. So it was hard to write it from all points of view, but it is in there. So, and that's a big thing that I felt like it's really important to have in there, because I do fault when I read Palestinian narratives, and that's what I meant to say, was that when I said before about showing both narratives, that I often do find that Palestinian narratives do not include that very vital piece of information. And I find that very, very problematic and inciting. I think it's just going to perpetuate the problem if we keep on both sides, keep only telling the story that makes our side look good, then this is never going to end. And so both sides need to acknowledge, we all, I don't even know if I'd call it mistakes necessarily, because these are things that happened in a certain historical period. And it's not clear that it was a mistake back then, but we do need to now be able to look back and say, maybe we can do things differently now when situations are changing, hopefully, and just to learn from the past. So, but yes, Diane, I think that's extremely important that we recognize that is the history of what happened.
And were you featured on Moment magazine a number of years ago wearing tefillin?
The picture wasn't me on the cover, but it was about, I think it was something that I wrote. I wrote a piece about why I applied to Yeshiva University Rabbinical School to be accepted into the rabbinical program. And then thankfully the picture on the cover wasn't me. It was a picture of somebody else, but yes, it was a woman wearing tefillin. So yeah, that was me a long time ago. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And actually, I was told now that this book, Hope Valley, is going to be reviewed in the November issue of Moment. So that's kind of
excellent.
things coming around.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Terrific.
Or I think. Oh wait, maybe it wasn't Moment. I'm sorry. Oh no, I think that it's Hadassah. Actually, I think it was Hadassah that it's going to be in. And Moment, I think I'm waiting to hear if they're going to review it. So sorry about that. No, yeah. I hope maybe somebody will hear this and decide to go ahead with it. Mm-hmm.
Well, I would say thank you very much. I think it's a fabulous book, a wonderful read, and I hope that everyone on the call who hasn't read it will read it now, and that they're inspired by the conversation. I think it's fascinating, and I think the topic is very right on the moment now with everything that's happening both in this country and in Israel. So it's a very
one thing I can also say that I think a lot of people might have thought like, oh, this is women's fiction, let's say, or it's a women's book. So I have to say that I've been so pleasantly surprised by how many men have not only told me that they love the book, and not even all Jewish men who are not even Jewish. So that's like even, not Jewish and not female, have actually told me that they cried when they read the book. So if that's a way to plug it, I think for me, that's like the height of, of all to have caused tears, especially in the non-Jewish man. So yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. It's a wonderful book. So thank you very much for joining us, Haviva, and thank you to all the women who have listened to this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
With pleasure. And thank you to Rabbi Ellen for connecting us so that we could make this opportunity possible. And I believe Merle and I are still in process for our dates in the coming new year. Merle, do you recall what's our first date? And I know that you've gotten some confirmations from our authors, but
I think that we'll put out an announcement in a couple of weeks to let everyone know
before the new year, but we're not probably having a date until October, I believe.
Right.
Is that right? Okay.
Right.
So I just know that people want to know ahead of time so they can put it on their calendars.
Right. So we'll get that out as quickly as we can so that everybody knows the upcoming books for this year.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, I just want, since we are in the month of Elul and we now are dedicating some of our time perhaps in reading to be inspired and look forward to a new year, 5782. Hopefully it will be a better year, that more of us will have our health matters under control and we'll be able to travel more. I just came back from traveling a little by car So hopefully we'll all have a meaningful new year and days of Yamim Norim, days of reflection, of thought, and we'll get back with you before then as to the dates. Everybody be well and continued well-being.
Thank you.